It's all just music, isn't it? That's the name of our podcast, by the way.
Yeah.
My name's Liam Boom, and Phil Beale is here with me today.
Good to see you.
We've got an interesting conversation coming up around something that we hear of often in the music industry. The word is plagiarism. Now, I spoke to Phil earlier about this. I said, what does the word mean? Is it anything to do with the plague? But
great
of course,
question as well. Yeah,
and Phil knows. He's going to tell me again. He's going to remind me.
I didn't know, but it sparked off an interest in me because I love the origins of language and stuff like that. And so I looked it up. I consulted with Dr. Google.
He looked it up.
I did, and apparently, interestingly enough, plagium, the Latin, or plagiarus, mean respectively a kidnapping or a kidnapper. So the act of lifting somebody's work and presenting it as your own is an act of kidnapping.
Ah, right, okay. Because I thought it was going to be something to do with the plague.
Yeah,
that the music industry is plagued with all these people who are robbing each other's music and stuff like that. But no. So it comes from a word that means to lift or take something or someone, in the case of kidnapping, that isn't or wasn't yours in the first place.
That's right.
But you've taken it for your own gain or purposes of... furthering your own aims. Right, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Now, it always sounded to me, plagiarism, when you heard about it in the music industry, is that it's a bad thing. If a musician was called a plagiarist, he'd be a villain, he'd be the baddie of the piece, and we should all frown upon him or her and dislike what they did. Is plagiarism always a very sort of villainous or criminal kind of act or behaviour, or is there anything that could be described as innocent plagiarism?
Yeah, I think there must be grey areas. There have to be grey areas, don't there? Especially if you talk about in law, which is where sometimes these cases do end up in law. Right. So you've got to then talk about, as you say, about intent. Was there intent or wasn't there? Right. Either way, if it's deemed to be a copy, then there will be consequences, financial consequences of that. But I think you're right. It's also about the moralistic aspect of it, isn't it? Was that intentional or wasn't it? Yeah,
because that's the thing that I was thinking about. Really, okay, maybe someone could accidentally copy someone's stuff and then later say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean that. There's some money as a compensation. Let's sort it out that way." Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
But what about someone who thinks, I know this belongs to someone else. I'm going to take it, put my name on it, and say it's mine. That is more of a kind of villainous, evil... What? Do you think so?
There are repeat offenders here. There are repeat offenders here.
Right.
We talked last week about the exploitation, probably back to the 60s, 70s, of rock musicians purloining black... artists from the 10s, 20s, 1920s, their work and sprucing it up and presenting it as their own. We talked about that last week. And there are repeat offenders that go beyond that. So we talked quite a bit about Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. It started off as an homage, I think, to the black artists of the 20s, but it went further than that. Whether you can blame the artists themselves or not sure really. Maybe it was the record company seeing an opportunity to make more money by not crediting the people who composed the stuff in the first place. That's a possibility. But Led Zeppelin come back on when we start talking about legalities and cases of plagiarism. They come back onto the scene again.
Dun, dun, dun.
Absolutely.
It's funny actually because I was talking to someone the other day, and we mentioned plagiarism. I think I mentioned Led Zeppelin, whatever. This person mentioned Henry VIII, a famous King of England in the 1500s, was it? Okay, he was supposedly the first person to rob someone else's music, and apparently he claimed to be the person who wrote the famous English folk song Green Sleeves. Green sleeves is my heart's delight. La, la, la.
Usually a beautiful song.
Lovely song. What do you mean usually?
Only kidding.
I want to have a look at my contract after this.
That was gorgeous.
Okay, thank you. But anyway, he said, I wrote that. Most people say, no, he didn't, but he was a bit of a hard man at the time, so no one argued. No. But there's other examples in history. I'm just thinking about, I don't know the full story, but Mozart himself was writing this fantastic requiem, and this guy Salieri, who was his overseer or he worked for him, tried to poison him to rob his music.
That's right.
So, you know, it's not a new thing that's just in relation to modern pop music.
No,
it's been going on for a long time.
That's right. I think if you watch the film that we mentioned before, Amadeus, which is all about that clash between Salieri and Mozart. Mozart being the boy wonder, the guy with a gift from God who could, at the age of 12, compose, I think, his first symphony. And there's Salieri, who's kind of the hard-working, maybe not quite as talented musician who's full of envy, apparently. It's a fascinating tale, isn't it? And it's a great film as well. But
so I think in those stories, like Mozart getting poisoned, if it was true, you know, that is really villainous. You can say, oh, that's like really criminal. He tried to kill him and to rob his music. But there's other examples of the composer Grieg. As a young man, he went and wandered off around his home country, listening to people singing folk songs in inns and pubs and stuff like that. And he wrote it all down. Then he came back and he wrote big major pieces, concertos and all this, that and the other. Okay, he did mention that his stuff was based on those old folk songs.
Right.
So what's he doing there? Is he kind of being a bit innocent and just borrowing stuff? Is he paying homage to the folk music? Or is he a bit more like Salieri did to Mozart? And is he just basically robbing other people's stuff?
I think I'd give him the benefit of the doubt there. I think it would be from musician to musician. In that case, I think he'd be more like paying an homage, I think, to the folk idiom and popularising it. Let's face it, beyond the scope of its its own ability to get out there, really. And there are other samples. We mentioned Beethoven, didn't we? Where in, I think it's the Sixth Symphony, where he uses during a particular one of the movements, he uses folk music, traditional German folk music. As the basis for the majority of that particular part of the symphony, you know. But again, it's acknowledged. It's about the acknowledgement. I think that's where when you come down to the morality of the thing, it's about the did you hide that? Did you pretend it was yours, or did you give the acknowledgement out there?
Okay, so the morality thing. I was just thinking about that, you know, because plagiarism happens in all sorts of different ways in different places, not just in the music industry.
Absolutely.
In fact, one of the things we were talking about is most students who go to university now, when they arrive at university in the first year, they have to sign all loads of documents promising they're not going to copy anyone else's work or download stuff and pretend it's theirs.
That's right.
So there's a big issue going on in higher education with plagiarism, and so much stuff is easily accessible on the internet. The temptation's there, but I'm still thinking, how do we draw the line, if we can, between someone who's doing something with, I don't know, villainous intent, they know they're doing something bad and they're changing their name, with someone else who's just saying, oh, I love this kind of music, so I think I'll reinvent it a bit, and maybe in doing so get it out to more people. So there's a positive side, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, without a doubt.
So how do we I mean, what the hell happens when a case goes to court? Have you any idea how a judge ends up trying to decide? Like in the Led Zeppelin story. I mean, how did the judge actually come to a conclusion there?
Well, let's look at a couple of cases in point, then we'll talk about Led Zeppelin. There are two cases that have come to court since the turn of the millennium, so long after the tracks were originally recorded and released. The first one was a guy called Jake Holmes, who probably none of us ever heard of, really. But Jake Holmes actually supported a band called the Yardbirds when they were on tour back in would have been the late 60s. And Jake Holmes wrote a song called Dazed and Confused.
Right.
And it had a particular riff, a very distinctive riff. And on the first Led Zeppelin album, which was released, recorded in late 68, released in early 69, there is a track on there called Dazed and Confused.
Okay.
And the riff, which to say is very distinctive, is exactly the same as Jake Holmes's track.
So they even used Jake Holmes as a title for the song?
Absolutely, even the title.
Okay. So hang on, didn't they just say, "Oh, thanks to Jake Holmes, we're doing a version of his song"? No, they didn't.
I'm afraid they didn't.
So did they try and say, "Hey, look, this is a song we've written completely"?
Well, all you can go on is the label, isn't it?
Sure.
All you can really go on is the record label, and Jake Holmes' name did not appear anywhere on the record label or on the cover, where it was where the listings are often there as well. No reference to Jake Holmes whatsoever.
Right.
That went to court, I think, only in the 2010s. I think it was.
Oh, right.
And Jake Holmes was absolutely he was vindicated. And he won a very large payout of cash for that.
Right.
And any records or CDs or a reference to that track from that point on mentions him as a co-composer.
Okay. So did the perpetrators, Zeppelin themselves, did they actually say, "Oh, okay, hands up"? Yeah, we did.
They'd have probably
that.
said, "Man, I was doing a lot of acid back then." I don't know. What would you say? What would you say?
I don't know.
But like I say, they're repeat offenders. We're talking here about a band I absolutely worship.
Right.
Still now, did
Yeah.
then and do now.
Yeah.
But these are things that you learn about as time goes on. They come out, don't they? These things come out over time. And the second case is with their anthem, "Stairway to Heaven," and a guy called Randy California launched a suit. He passed away before it came to fruition, actually, but he was in a band called Spirit out of California at the time, the late 60s. And again, there must have been some cross-pollination there, because the opening sequence of notes in their track, which I can't remember the title of now, but they're identical to the opening sequence of notes on A Stairway to Heaven.
Right.
And I have heard both, and it really is identical. Having said that, when you get to the end of that first passage, Stairway to Heaven goes off in a completely different direction.
Okay.
And the two tracks aren't comparable.
Yeah.
When that came to court, Zeppelin won out. They won the case. The judge said, "Yes, of course, there's a similarity.
Yeah.
We've always got a note in every one of these cases. There are only 12 musical notes in the scale, so there will always be some coincidental reproduction. It's inevitable, you know." And they won the case in that instance.
Okay.
Interesting.
So the people who were judging those cases, I'm guessing they must have an incredible wealth of knowledge of music as well as law. Would that be the case?
I think they must have.
They'd have to, wouldn't they?
It's an industry in its own right. I mean, the amount of money that we're talking about here, it's millions and millions of dollars in potential.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's look at a few more examples, I guess, is the best way to proceed with it, just to try and figure out what the intent was, perhaps.
Right. Okay.
Another really famous one is George Harrison. In fact, there are two Beatles cases, which is quite interesting in its own right. We'll talk about George's first. After he left the Beatles, his first hit was "My Sweet Lord."
Oh yeah, "My Sweet Lord."
Great song, fabulous song. But it immediately sparked a court case from the composers of a track called "He's So Fine."
He's so fine. Do-lang, do-lang,
exactly.
Do-lang,
by girl group The Chiffons.
Yeah.
Now, you've just sung the two there, and thank you for doing that.
Oh, I don't mention it.
But they are identical. That melody is identical in both cases.
Yeah.
So it was put back to George, you know, at the time. He had to. It went to court very quickly, and he lost the case. Yeah. And once again, I think all the royalties from "My Sweet Lord" were awarded to the composers of that Chiffons song. So
what did George say then, you know, as his defence? Because as far as I remember, when George came out of that case, he didn't come out as like a bad guy or a villain or a thief. He came out.
He didn't.
A bit sort of naive.
I think that's right.
What did he say?
I think that's right. Well, we know from our own knowledge of the Beatles and their recorded work that they were massive fans of girl groups like the Chiffons.
Sure.
Who else can we think of? The Ronettes. They covered all sorts of girl group acts that they absolutely adored and worshipped and covered. About 4 tracks on their first album were by girl groups. So it's beyond reasonable doubt, I think, that George would, without a doubt, have been familiar with that track. It was a big hit in its own right. It's not like it was an obscure song.
Sure.
But at the time he said, "This was completely unconscious. I've obviously subconsciously recycled a song and produced my own version of it. But innocently, and I think I think I could give him the benefit of the doubt there.
Yeah, yeah.
He still had to pay the money out.
He still has to pay out the money, okay, but he had to pay out the money, but he comes out as a kind of a good guy with his hands clean.
That's right, yeah.
But you've given some other examples of people who had to pay the money, but they looked a bit more kind of
a bit more shady, maybe
villainous and so on.
Yeah.
But what I sort of think it must be very difficult to sift through if you were trying to judge a case like this, is music gets involved in genres, doesn't it?
Okay.
Types and styles. We all know rock and roll. We're going to hear that through almost all rock and roll, but no one's saying you're copying it. And people actually construct music to fit genres: rock and roll, country music, heavy metal, and so on.
Yeah.
So if you're actually trying to fit into a genre, you've got to use loads of markers and recognizable things to fit in the model of that genre. And generally speaking, most people aren't putting their hands up all the time and saying, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, because there's a lot of sharing, isn't there?
You've just kind of you've sung out there what would be the beginning of a 12-bar, I guess, really, a 12-bar blues. Now, 12-bar blues goes literally back to the cotton fields, really, and possibly even further across there back into Africa, potentially. I can't verify or give you examples of that, but certainly 12-bar blues originated in the cotton fields with one guy with a guitar. It then moved into the area of jazz. Lots and lots of trad jazz particularly is based on those 12 bars, that 12-bar design, if you like, for a song, and went further into big band jazz into the 30s and the 40s, and then ultimately landed in the 50s with people like Bill Haley or whoever you can name, really, who still were using the same model. Yeah. But I don't think you would call that plagiarism, would you? Because it's a bit like saying, well, all symphonies have a slow movement. Yeah. They do.
Okay, so, I think what I'm getting now is, if you think of motor car companies, they make motor cars. Just about every motor car company in the world makes a 2-door hatch.
Exactly.
The seats 4 people. You can get it in blue, and it's got an engine of about 1200 cc.
Exactly.
But they're not copying off each other.
That's right.
But that's a grouping or a genre where you expect a load of things to be similar or almost the same as other products within that genre. Yeah, so there's always going to be characteristics of rock and roll or country music or heavy metal and so on. So if you hear those characteristics, you don't necessarily say they were invented by an individual person, because everyone in that genre is using those musical characteristics. So
as a model, I guess you'd say, wouldn't you?
So
as a model for
at what point then do you think, hang on, wait a minute, they're using the same characteristics as the genre, and other bands use those same characteristics, but on this occasion it's too similar? You know, what are you looking for that makes you think, bing, plagiarism?
First and foremost, I would say there, Liam, lyrics. If you lift the lyrics, then that's definite, isn't it? You know, there's no argument there. So when you got, I've been dazed and confused for so long, it's not true. If somebody else has written those lyrics 20 years before, and you're found out, how about another Beatles example? Here, Come Old Flat Top. Yeah, okay. So the lyrics are important. Yeah, okay. So you might have something that sounds similar to something else, but the lyrics are like, if they're obvious, like, since my baby left me, I found a new place to go. If I write my own lyrics, the cat just ate the cornflakes, the dog is chewing my shoe, would I get away with that? I need to know. I'm not sure it'd sell.
I need to know, because I'm working on that. I know.
This is your new single, is it?
Right. Okay. What if I sing that but I change the tempo of it?
Well, these are all they're all variables, aren't they? I think, you know, and that's that's what a judge or a jury would have to decide, really. Right. These things can be very subjective, obviously, but the lyrics are fairly definitive, as we say. Like, I just mentioned here, "Come On Flat Top," which for the initiated wouldn't recognise, but that's the opening line of a brilliant Beatles track called "Come Together." Which I think was the B-side of "Hey Jude," I think. But
come on, old flat top, he going.
grooving up slowly, he got all that stuff. Yeah,
but that's based on.
That's lifted wholesale from a track by Chuck Berry from the 50s called "You Can't Catch Me."
You can't catch me.
So the songs wouldn't have been in any way alike,
right?
But that's literally lifted word for word from the opening to "You Can't Catch Me" by Chuck Berry. So where did that go? That went to court, and Lennon, of course, had to admit, yes, I did definitely use Chuck's
But didn't
words.
he say, "Oh, I was doing it as a homage to Chuck because he's so cool"?
Of course, he was one of his heroes. Absolutely,
yeah.
But it came down to the money, and they had to pay up. But they did it in quite a novel way. They didn't. It wasn't about giving him a bunch of cash. What Lennon agreed to do was to record that song and I think one more and put it and then give all the royalties from those recordings to the Berry estate. So he actually produced a full album of rock and roll covers called Rock and Roll.
Cool, that's
originally.
Cool. Yeah, that's cool. So he presumably made some money himself out of that
of course,
as well.
That's right. Yes, that's right. It was a massive hit as an album.
Right.
And all of the proportion for those two Berry songs that he covered went straight to Chuck Berry or his estate or whatever. So that was how that one worked out.
Right.
Interesting stuff.
So things that are a little bit. I'm trying to look like things that are a bit clearer, but I'm not sure they are.
I'm not sure they are either.
So, okay, plagiarism sounds like that. Just the word sounds like a really bad criminal thing,
right?
And plagiarism is when the person, the plagiarizer, let's call him or her, knowingly they know what they're doing and they take something that they know belongs to someone else.
Yeah.
They take it and they then use it and say it's their own.
That's
and they're
right.
doing that for the purpose of gaining.
That's right.
But there's other ways in which people end up using other people's stuff, maybe with less knowledge, with less understanding, maybe more naivety, more coincidence, but they can equally end up in court and having to pay out.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So just the fact that you end up in court and you have to pay out doesn't mean you're a bad dude.
No,
definitely not. But definitely some of them. Okay, who's the baddest plagiarizing dude in your view or opinion?
The baddest of the bad. Well, there's a great old saying. It's been around for 100 years probably. Yeah. Where there's a hit, there's a writ. How about that? That's folks. A great tagline. Where there's a hit, there's a writ. I like it. I think of the ones that I'm aware of, I think I'd have to point the finger primarily at Jimmy Page out of Led Zeppelin. I think as the repeat offender.
Yeah.
Who's been in the court, more than once, and so I think maybe Jimmy's the bad boy.
Okay, so he's like a major mega superstar, and we know him from the 60s, 70s, so on and so forth. Fantastic. I think there's probably loads of occasions though where people are borrowing or ripping off or using other people's music that never gets to court because it never really no one makes any money out of it. In fact, I think you gave me an example once, didn't you? Say you were in a pub and it was a pub band playing in Birmingham once.
Absolutely,
What was that? Tell us again.
Well, that's a pub band. They're obviously getting paid for what they're doing. They're a great band. They were a soul band, and we're going back to the early 90s now. So things like sampling to me, I'd never heard of it. But the guy had got what looked like a standard keyboard, but every time he played the top few keys, he got James Brown's horn section sampled on these keys, and it sounded absolutely incredible. Wow. I was blown away. Absolutely.
And you were looking around for the brass section.
Well, yeah, what the hell's going on? It was astonishing, absolutely. Yeah. So that's the first example of sampling that I ever saw, or in the flesh, as it were. They were obviously getting remuneration for that, but they were doing a great job. They're entertaining a bunch of people in a rugby club that night. It was fantastic.
So maybe they're getting paid for doing the gig, etc. As far as you know, they didn't go out and record those tracks. No. So there was no chance that James Brown's lawyer was going to turn up at the rugby club, with a big loud hail and say, "We're taking you to court, mister. We're taking you." That wasn't going to happen. No. So there must be loads of occasions when, because of the monetary value of pursuing the case is so low or non-existent that a case never gets pursued.
That's right.
And people get away with. In fact, I've just a thought's just come to my mind. What happens when I'm walking through the city centre?
Yep.
And there's a busker with a guitar.
Well, obviously,
and he's singing someone else's song.
Yeah, he's getting potentially getting some cash for that.
Yeah.
And and yes, he's technically breaching the Performing Rights Society's
Right,
rules and
okay.
regulations, and he should be paying. He should be paying.
Right,
But I think it only applies if you actually got a formal contract to be paid for what you're doing.
Okay, then I'm just thinking now. I'm trying to think of a dead smart question. I've got this hat on, and okay, so for me,
thinking cap on.
I'm trying to work out now whether it's good or bad that people are chased up and punished for borrowing, lifting, using other people's stuff, or whether that's just a normal thing that happens in music. I think we've just said there's buskers and pub bands copy bits and pieces of stuff and they don't get pursued.
Covers bands every
But
night.
well-known recording artist Jimmy Page, for example, who have the potential to make millions, do get chased into court. How much of it is just a music industry money-grabbing kind of exercise, all this chasing up?
I think it's
plagiarism?
more than that. I think it's people that are making their living out of this.
Right.
They deserve that recognition and they deserve that remuneration.
Okay.
I think the internet, of course, and the advent of downloading in particular has opened up a whole can of worms. You know, and it's opened up Pandora's box, and it's never going to be put back in again. You know, so that's why we are now in the situation where I can pay $7.99 or whatever it is a month to Apple. Mm-hmm. And I've got the right to access, play, and use millions of songs. Literally,
Right, okay.
Who's going to pay the people that created that stuff? It has to be managed properly.
Sure. Okay.
They deserve that. If they're the creatives, they deserve that recognition. They deserve that remuneration. Which I have done recently, I've put my first song up on Spotify. And that's 30 years ago. To have it effectively a single release would have been a massive event. There are about, I don't know, 160,000 records released or tracks released on the internet a day now, I think, probably.
What? Per day?
If you want to earn £100, if I want to earn £100 for my song, in terms of the amount of times, or in terms of it being played by people, downloaded or played by people, it has to happen 140,000 times for me to earn £100.
140,000 times. Okay, so how many pence is that per time?
0.0000 something.
0.0014. Okay.
That's the point we've reached. So
you'd be better busking with a cup or
without
a
a doubt. I mean,
You'd probably get more.
we know people that come in here and we talk to them. They earn £100 sometimes for a busking afternoon. You know, so you're right, but it's about scale. Obviously, it's about scale by definition. So what has happened with the opening out of music onto the internet and all the samples, all that sort of stuff, but it's given access to many more people to release music. Like pretty much anybody now, if you can play an instrument or you can put string a few lyrics together, you can put a song down at home in your bedroom, and you can release it on the internet. And who knows, somebody might hear it and it might get picked up, and you might earn a lot of money. Whereas 30 years ago, you'd have been given an advance by a record company. You'd have been one of the, 100,000 people that approached the record company and got chosen, and it would have been a very significant event. It's a far less significant event now. But it's opened up creativity across a broad range of people.
You've just reminded me, actually. I can remember one time, a long time ago when I was a kid, I was walking somewhere with my dad, maybe by London Road in Liverpool, and there was a big queue of people with guitars and everything outside the shop on a Saturday morning, and they were queuing up. And the guy in the shop, he had a sound booth.
Right.
And you could go in and you could sing, and your song would be recorded straight onto a vinyl disc. And you'd pay him and you'd get 2 of the vinyl discs and you'd get a paper sleeve and everything. And the queue was a mile long.
Fantastic.
But it was all, it was mostly young men with some girls there, mostly just acoustic guitars. So it was very low tech, but obviously you could tell by the queues that this was something in big demand and was just going to get bigger and bigger. So what we've got now, instead of 100 people in a queue to use one facility, those 100 people are all at home with the facility in the bedroom, aren't they?
They are.
And they can do it there, and they can all do it, and then they can all, as you say, access release of it immediately.
Absolutely right.
Does that mean then, I'm just checking this one out, does it mean there's too much music being put out there?
Wow, I haven't got an answer to that. There's certainly it's now ubiquitous. When I grew up in the 60s, if I wanted to see the Beatles or hear the Beatles, it was an event if they were on TV.
Right.
And everything stopped because people knew that night and that Saturday night, and thank your lucky stars, they were going to be on the telly.
Sure.
Everybody dropped everything at 6 o'clock so they could watch that event. Right. Whereas now it's everywhere, isn't it? It's obviously everywhere. Yeah. I, as a musician, I think it's a great thing personally. I think it's a wonderful thing that people have the opportunity to create, and the technology is relatively cheap. If you've got a laptop and you've got internet access, the software's free. Download the software, start creating.
Okay, then. Is it then all a gain, win-win situation? Or what, if anything, in your view, have we lost with all this new technological access to music?
I'm not sure what we've lost. I think what a lot of people have gained, though, is a sense of a creative aspect to their lives, which they might not have had otherwise, which I think is wonderful in many different ways, particularly mental health. I think it's wonderful. If you can express what you're feeling through the medium of music, I think it's a great outlet that you might not have otherwise.
Sure.
So I think it can be a really positive thing.
Sure. I mean, one thing that seems to be missing or less of, you mentioned before about when you knew the Beatles were going to be on telly on Friday night when you were a kid, you'd stop everything and there'd be an element of event about it. Yeah. Absolutely. And there was always events back in the 60s when bands brought new singles or LPs out and this, that and the other, and people were going queue up at HMV and all that on Saturday morning to try and get. So that's been lost. You know, if that was a good thing, and I think it was an okay thing, we've lost quite a bit of that because, as you've just said, you've released a single from basically, for argument's sake, let's say from your own bedroom kind of thing. Okay. You've released a single, whereas if you wanted to do that 30 years ago, there'd be so much more involved and there'd be more publicity and events and this, that and the other. Yeah. So, you know, what have we lost?
And it still might have sunk without trace, potentially.
It still might have sunk without trace. So I think we've lost something there because there was always elements of event and things happening. Okay. Yeah, so some of that is not there anymore. You know, you can listen. I could listen to your song at home tonight on my own. I don't have to go and queue up and pay to get into a venue to see you do it live. I'd like to do that. That would be great. Yeah. I'd love to be able to. But we've lost quite a bit of that now. Although there's still live music going on, we've lost quite a bit of that. And maybe, I'm just wondering whether musicians are a bit more isolated now than they used to be.
Oh, they have been for the last 2 years, without a doubt, with coronavirus.
Well, definitely with coronavirus.
God, absolutely.
But if you've got one of those keyboards and a computer and everything at home, can't you more or less produce an album on your own?
Well, we talked about that just a short while ago, didn't we? Yeah. It was a Casio thing, was it? The original Casio electronic keyboard? Yeah. Well, that started off in everybody, you know, in every kid's flipping Christmas stocking, you know. Absolutely. And most of it went no further than that. Yeah. But some of it went a lot further than that, and that was the origin of a whole new genre of music.
Right. Okay.
Which was pretty much UK or Europe, certainly Europe orientated. Bands like Kraftwerk from Germany, Human League, loads of bands, Soft Cell, all synthesizer orientated with electronic drum backing tracks. Yes. But it all started out from that Casio keyboard.
Right, okay. So I've got a vague memory as a kid, you know, getting on the bus to go somewhere, and there'd be like a couple of lads would be getting on the bus with guitars and going, where are you going? And they said, we're going round to our mates. There's about 5 of us meeting up and we're going to form the band. We're going to write some songs and stuff. But you don't really get or see that now because just 1 or 2 of those kids could just sit in a bedroom and do the whole thing.
So that's true.
So we've lost, I'm trying to put my finger on what we've lost. I've said it's a sense of event. Maybe it's more like a communal group thing because we used to call groups, didn't we? because there was a group of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, 5 of them, whatever.
And a band had to have at least 20 people.
Yeah. But nowadays,
and trumpets.
Exactly. So if one person on their own can make a song, make an album, there's a lot more solo acts and musicians now.
Okay.
I'm not saying that's wrong or bad. I'm saying, have we lost something that used to be more based on community and stuff?
I think it's less exclusive now in technical ways. For example, the first example of an artist creating an album and playing everything on the album, you might know where I'm going with this, was probably Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield.
Oh, yeah.
An absolutely wonderful symphony, if you like, a modern symphony, where he played literally every instrument.
Right, okay.
And it took a very, very long time, and a lot of studio time, because he had to continually overdub and continually go through that process time and time and time again until he had this wonderful, in actual fact, in 2 movements, 2 sides of a vinyl album, a masterpiece.
Right, okay.
Literally a masterpiece.
Yeah.
But he had to be a trained musician to do any of that.
Of course, yeah.
Of course he did. Now, we can actually replicate that today and not be a trained musician.
Right, with the technology.
With the technology,
yeah.
Absolutely. So, again, Mike Oldfield was never in his bedroom doing this. That technology didn't exist.
Okay.
Mike Oldfield was a kind of a, how could you put it, probably a 3rd division, or he played in 3rd division bands at the time. He happened to come across a very kind person called Richard Branson, who was recording other acts in his studio, and Mike Oldfield's hanging around, and he gave Mike Oldfield the freedom of the studio in downtime. So when other bands weren't recording, more famous bands weren't recording, he said to Mike, because he's a nice guy and a fellow hippie,
right,
just use the studio when you need to, mate.
It's all right, isn't it?
And after quite a long period of time, he went in and said, "Well, what have you got, Mike? Is it going anywhere?"
Yeah.
And Mike Oldfield played him the first part of the first side of side 1, track 1, effectively, of Tubular Bells, and Richard Branson said, "Keep going, mate. Keep going. Let's see what. Let's see what comes of this."
Yeah.
What came of that, if you want to take it full circle, is a financial empire. Which consists of airlines and God knows what else, and it was all based on Tubular Bells, because Tubular Bells was the most enormous worldwide success.
Right.
And the whole of the Branson Virgin Empire was built on the back of that. It was the first release on Virgin Records.
Right.
And so that's what came from that. Where am I going with this? I'm not sure. But what you can do now is you can do that within your bedroom, literally using samples on a PC.
Yeah.
You still have to pay for the right to use the samples to be legal.
Okay, yeah.
But you can do it all yourself without any necessarily musical skills at all. You don't even have to know how to play a keyboard necessarily.
Right. God,
to create a symphony of your own.
Okay, just say for example then, just there I was trying to make a tune in my bedroom, and I listened to something, and I like this. I thought, oh, I'm having that.
Yes.
Typically, how much would that cost me to put that on my song?
Well, the way it works is you buy the software that assists you in composing and recording, and it will come with a sequence, with a selection of those of examples of different drum tracks and drum rhythms, for example, and a selection of guitar tracks, and a selection of bass notes and rhythms. And you will pay for the right to use that within the cost of the software initially. Oh,
okay. So if I use anything that is in the software and comes with it, I've already paid to use that by buying the software.
Correct.
Okay.
So what would have happened is that somebody would have actually laid those tracks down in a studio somewhere. It would have been digitised, and every time that software gets sold, they get a few pence probably out of the money that you pay for that software. Okay.
So if I use that. You like the way I do that, don't you, Phil?
That's great. It's almost beatboxing, man.
So if I say, "Oh, great, I'm using that," and if I pay somebody, there's two things I want to know roughly, if you know, how much do you think I'd have to pay? And if I do pay for it, can someone else still come along and use it on their one of their
Well,
tracks?
not legally, but as to how much it costs, I think an example of this software would be Logic, which we use here in the studios here. I think Logic's about £200 to buy, I think.
Right, okay.
And it does include selection, but it doesn't include all of the tracks that you might want to use. And if you want to use a further range, or you want access to a further range of, for example, drum rhythms and patterns, you have to add in plug-in packs of samples. And again, once that happens, whoever's work is contained within that pack, it will be
But I'm only buying or paying to use it. I'm not buying it. I'm not saying it's mine now. No one else can use it. Anyone else could also pay for it. And they could use it.
Well, that's another interesting subject. But just to finish that point, what that allows you to do is to take that rhythm track and record it, re-record it, or use it as part of your own recording, layer on top of it, and then release it, and all the royalties from that will come to you. Right. You won't have to give credit to anybody else in turn.
Okay.
But it's really quite interesting that there are some which are repeatedly used. It's really quite fascinating. On Led Zeppelin 4, it's quite strange that they keep coming with the conversation. It's by accident rather than by design. But on Led Zeppelin 4, there is a track called "When the Levee Breaks." Now, funnily enough, that was also the subject of a claim. Memphis Minnie claimed that she wrote "When the Levee Breaks" back in the 1930s. Turned out she actually did.
Right.
But that's not the point of this part of the conversation. The drum track that John Bonham laid out at the beginning of "When the Levee Breaks" is classic. It's original. It's his own composition. Yeah. It makes the song, and it became the most sampled drum track of all down the decades since.
Yeah.
It's a bit like James Brown's horn section. It's a bit like dum 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 dum. That bass pattern, bass rhythm came from back in the days of Chic and Nile Rodgers, and by Bernard Edwards. In actual fact, he composed that. It was then used obviously for their Good Times. Good times, we all want good times. So that was the original release. Then the first first group of people to separate that out and do something else with it was the Sugar Hill Gang, who then created Rapper's Delight using exactly that rhythm, bass rhythm. And that went to court. Noel Rodgers and Bernard Edwards sued the Sugar Hill Gang for the use of that, but it was a worldwide smash hit. So everybody won really, and rap became, came to the surface really on the back of Rapper's Delight really.
I get that then.
So and that rhythm is used time and time again throughout new compositions.
So is it harder now for people to take other people to court and say that's mine? Because if I bought the use of a rhythm track and then the use of a bass track, something, put two or three things together to make my music, somebody else with the same software and the same package could also use the same three things for their song.
Correct.
Can I take them to court?
Or is it, you didn't. No, you just used it. No, the way that's supposed to work. I'm not saying it does work like this in practice, but the way it's supposed to work is that because they also bought the software, that credit also went to the original composers and players, and so they got their credit, so they can then use it to create whatever they want to use with it. But it always goes back to the origin, and the origin is the person that composed it and the person that performed it.
So much stuff that sounds very, very similar. I mean, just briefly earlier on, we were talking about Ringo Starr and how he joined the Beatles. And before he was in the Beatles, he had a drum kit, and he was a great drummer, and he'd be the drummer for lots of different bands. There might be 5 or 6 bands playing on stage at a particular venue that night, and 4 of them might say, "Oh, Ringo, do us a favour, stay on stage and play the drums for us." When you went, yeah. So he did all the different things he did, the different styles of drumming, mostly, rock and roll kind of thing. And he did all those different styles and so on, and they were very similar. So he often might have been, and any drummer in the 60s playing live may have often been playing very similar, drum patterns.
Very much so.
Throughout, rock and roll, because it was genre based. But I mean, how would you go about trying to claim ownership, original ownership of something like that, when more or less everyone was doing it all the time? I don't understand how you could isolate it and identify it.
Well, as you said, and it's a great story which I hadn't heard before, but I'm sure it's absolutely right, that they'd have different covers for the front of the bass drum.
Yeah.
And Rico would stay on the drum stool, and they'd just give him a different name on the front,
of his
bass
drum. Or sometimes he'd say, I'll take the blue jacket off, put the red jacket
yeah,
or I'll put the yellow jacket on to play with these. Obviously, he was a great drummer. He was very professional. He knew what he was doing, and any band could say, Ringo, just play for us. We're playing rock and roll.
That's
okay.
Right.
And
That's
he
right.
just played for them.
That's right. But the question that you're asking, I don't know, really. No. I don't know. But they're good and bad, aren't they? And Pete Best apparently wasn't very good, and Ringo was.
Yeah.
And I'm not a drummer, so I'm not making that judgment.
No, okay.
But Pete Best got his remuneration in the end as well.
Yeah, he did.
Bless him.
Yeah, in all fairness. Okay, so to try and sum up now, if I can, I thought by the end of this I'd understand what was going on with plagiarism and copying. I'm still a bit unsure. Plagiarism sounds like a really bad thing. It sounds like a villainous crime,
right?
But there's aspects of it
that grey areas,
could be
mate.
Naive and a bit innocent, and so on and so forth.
Grey areas.
But in the end, I'm also thinking that we only heard of court cases when there's loads of money involved, and where there's little or no money involved, nobody seems to bother.
No, there's no loss, is there?
Right.
There's no loss. You've got to just remember the tagline of this whole thing, really. Where there's a hit underlined, there's a writ.
Okay, I'll try and remember that. Where there's a hit, there's a writ. Okay, so, but in the end, I think as the title of our podcast still stands, it's all just music, isn't it? And in the end, I think it is, and it's what goes in your ears that matters.
And do you enjoy it?
And do you enjoy it?
That's
and if it makes you dance. But there's a whole load of marshy, quagmiry stuff that I think has come about through the development of the music industry, the industrialization of music, and how it's disseminated,
spot on,
and sold to people. As soon as there's some money involved, things get really difficult,
spot on,
and complicated. Yeah,
spot on.
So there's you agree with me? There's a big difference between music and the music industry, isn't there?
Definitely.
Right. Okay. Well, we love music.
We do.
And it is all just music, isn't it?
It is all just music at the end of the day.
Okay. We've been Phil Beale, Liam Boom, and we've been here today with Liverpool Online Music, and we're going to wind up our podcast now, and then we're going to go off and I'm not going to tell you what we're going to do afterwards.
We're actually going to listen to a few songs and make some comparisons. That's what we're doing.
Definitely going to do, because there's some of those comparisons which you hear both of them and you think,
that's right.
What were they thinking? Whereas some of the others are far more complicated. You have to listen really carefully.
That's right. There you go, mate. Boom.
Yeah, boom. Okay. A last word from Phil.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Right.
Hope you did too.
Okay. It's been a thank you from
See you next
Phil,
week.
And thank you from him. Cheers and ta-ra.